take a look at Badger and Pache airbrushes. Great hobby art product that has a lot of different uses and is thus very popular. Airbrushes are something that you kind of have to learn to use them, but once you do, it's like riding a bike, you never forget. So I'm going to do a few short segmented videos that will put together the basics of airbrushing, and especially pertaining to Badger and Pache airbrushes. So sit back and let's take a look at Badger and Pache. What is an airbrush? An airbrush is an air-operated tool that sprays various art medium, in our case hobby paint. An airbrush works by passing a stream of compressed air through a venturi that creates suction, pulling paint from a reservoir. The high velocity of the air atomizes the paint and sprays tiny droplets onto a surface. There are three different characteristics that define what type of airbrush you have, and that would be the action, the feed, and the mix. So let's take a closer look at all three of these things and get an idea of what the difference is between all these different airbrushes. The first airbrush characteristic we'll look at is the action used to trigger the paint flow. There's two types of actions on an airbrush. The first that we'll talk about is a single action airbrush. On a single action airbrush, the trigger activates the airflow, and then the color flow where the spray pattern is adjusted physically by turning the nozzle cone. Now, the second type of action is a double action, which you have two actions on the trigger. You have the trigger to press for airflow like the single action airbrush, but instead of manipulating the airflow or the paint flow with the nozzle, you basically pull the trigger backwards and it brings the needle inside of the airbrush in and widens and narrows the paint flow. So single action is just airflow on the trigger, double action is airflow on the trigger and paint flow adjustment by pulling the trigger back and forth. So there's two actions or double action on this trigger. The next characteristic we'll discuss is the feed. Feed refers to the place of entry and the manner in which the paint enters the airbrush. There's two different types of feed, bottom feed and gravity feed. This external Badger 350 airbrush has a bottom feed, where it feeds paint up a siphon tube from the bottom and into the nozzle. You can also use a color cup to do the same thing. You put your paint in the color cup and it feeds up from the bottom. This Badger Patriot is a good example of a gravity feed airbrush. On a gravity feed airbrush, the paint is put into the cup and it flows down via gravity into the brush and mixes inside internally. So you have bottom feed and gravity feed. The last characteristic we'll discuss about airbrushes is the mix point. The mix refers to the manner in which the air and paint come together and atomize in the airbrush. There's two types of mixes, an internal mix and an external mix. On the external mix airbrushes, the paint is pulled up through the bottom, through the nozzle, and the air comes out and they meet outside of the gun, so they mix externally. This creates a coarser, rounder spray pattern. On this internal mix air gun, the air and the paint mix inside of the air gun, and you move the nozzle back to spray. This creates a precisely atomized fine dot spray pattern, so you can do more effects and you get a finer spray pattern with the internal mix. So you have external mix and internal mix. The last thing we'll discuss in part one of our airbrush video series are extra parts for your airbrushes. And in particular, we'll talk about the different nozzles and needle sizes for each type of air gun. There's various airbrush nozzle sizes, and although they have some effect on the line an airbrush produces, the nozzle sizes apply more to the material that should be sprayed through the airbrush than the fineness of the line they produce. So each one of these airbrushes can be changed out with three different size needles and nozzles, and they come in fine, medium, and heavy. As you can see, the external brush has a nozzle and a needle, and the internal mix airbrush double action has a needle, a nozzle, and a nozzle cone. So each of these airbrushes can be changed out to spray different viscosities or thicknesses of material. And the heavier your paint or material, the larger or heavier the needle and nozzle needs to be. So take that into account when you pick out the paints you use. And my rule of thumb is always go with a medium-sized needle and nozzle to start out with, and then you can figure your way from there.